Thank you. The next item of business is a debate on motion 17524 in the name of Miles Briggs on review of additional support for learning and implementation of mainstreaming. I would invite those members who would wish to speak in the debate to please press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Miles Briggs to speak to and to move the motion. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I'm pleased to open this important debate on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Audit Scotland's report earlier this year into additional learning support was damning and highlighted the SNP Scottish Government's failure to plan and resource accordingly to tackle the issue. Teachers and school staff are facing unprecedented pressures, and our most vulnerable pupils are being let down. Over 40% of Scottish pupils are receiving additional support for learning, and here in Edinburgh, in my own region, that number has grown by more than 165% over the last 10 years. ASM pupils now represent 39% and 52% of Edinburgh's primary and secondary school population, respectively. The Audit Scotland report rightly called on the Scottish Government and councils to fundamentally rethink how they plan, fund and staff additional support for learning as part of their core school education in Scotland. Stephen Boyle, the Auditor-General for Scotland, said the Scottish Government has failed to plan effectively for its inclusive approach to additional support for learning. Current gaps in data mean it is unclear whether all children's rights in education have been fully developed to help them develop their personality, talents and abilities. The Scottish Government and councils urgently need better quality data to understand pupils' additional support needs and the resources required to provide that support. Ruth MacLeod, the member of the Accounts Commission, also said councils and the Scottish Government must fundamentally rethink how additional support for learning is being planned and provided. And I agree, and that's why we have brought this debate to Parliament today. Deputy Presiding Officer, fundamentally, we need to urgently understand why the levels of additional support for learning in our schools stand as they are, and then realistically look to what the Scottish Government and our councils can do to meet that demand and prioritise resources as well. Teachers are telling us again and again that we need to see leadership to understand how we're going to provide that additional support and what that actually looks like on the ground. I'm deeply concerned that the message which is coming from teachers and parents is they can't cope unless urgent and significant investment is made to enable schools to effectively deliver the support which we need. It's also important that we understand the implementation of mainstreaming and the impact this is having both on teachers and also the wider school community and the additional pressures that has brought. In recent weeks, Deputy Presiding Officer, at First Minister's questions, I've raised two issues. Firstly, the issue of children and young people seeking ADHD and autism diagnosis pathways and then being removed from CAMHS waiting lists without suitable alternatives or being told or signposted to the third sector support. The Scottish Government's press release celebrating the Scottish Government meeting the target for referral for CAMHS for the first time they set almost a decade ago was celebrating that fact. But I have to say, speaking to parents and parents I represent here in Lothian, that was a slap in the face for so many who have been waiting and waiting and waiting, many of which have now decided that they will seek private diagnosis, with then no clear pathway put in place to deliver the shared care with GP surgeries for their children. The truth is, the only reason why ministers have been able to say that the target was met is because children and young people seeking an ADHD or autism diagnosis have been removed from these numbers. As one parent said to me, it feels like these waiting times have been gerrymandered, and I agree. And that's why we're calling for a review today, and I hope Parliament will back that. And I'm deeply concerned that in recent months we've also seen three of our major health boards, my own here in NHS Lothian, the ministers in Highland and also in Tayside, escalated to level 3 of the government's support and escalation framework as a result of mental health performance, specifically around CAMHS. Given these figures will have changed, how will they be judged on improvement now that so many children are being taken off that waiting list? It's a question not just I am asking, but the Royal College of Psychiatrists in Scotland have said that the number of children on separate waiting lists to be assessed for neurodevelopmental conditions is now not routinely being published by the Scottish Government. They need to be more transparent, and I agree on that call. Dr Laura Sutherland, who's the Vice Chair of the Royal College of Psychiatrists in Scotland and their child and adolescent faculty said children who are at most risk are prioritised, which can then result in people with a neurodevelopmental condition waiting even longer. Often there is not an immediate risk, which is why some of these young people can wait longer, but overall there is a longer-term impact. It means young people can't get into education or be supported adequately, and ultimately these young people will go on to develop mental health conditions on the back of their neurodiverse condition. Presiding Officer, these two issues are critically important, and we need to see action, and we need to see ministers take that forward. Now, turning to today's amendments, I have no problem with the government's amendment, but that's because they simply state that Parliament agrees that all children and young people should receive the help they need to thrive. We agree, but after 18 years, we need to ask why the Scottish Government are not delivering that. And I welcome what is contained in the Labour amendment for today as well. Very much agree that 10 years on, I think, from the Morgan Review, we have not seen the progress we should have. And although not selected today, the Green Party amendment, I think, very importantly, does point out that the concern that we only have 1,215 children in Scotland who have actually now got in place a coordinated support plan. That represents 0.4 of all children recognised with additional support need. At this rate, ministers will continue to fail, and we need a rethink. That is why we are calling for action. And I believe there are solutions out there to support what we want to see. Last week I visited The Yard, a wonderful charity here based in Edinburgh, and I apologise to the Cabinet Secretary because I might have inadvertently signed her up to a visit to go and see their facility, but also the fantastic resources they have developed to actually provide models of support to teachers and the wider classroom and school community. We need to see these embraced and rolled out nationally. Deputy Presiding Officer, to conclude, I hope today's debate can act as a wake-up call for ministers and for the Scottish Government and our councils to recognise they are not delivering the support our children and young people need. That's why, if Parliament supports my motion at decision time this evening, I hope we can see clear timelines from the Scottish Government on when these key reviews will take place. We urgently need this action, and I know teachers and parents are growing more and more concerned at the failure to provide and resource the planning for additional support for learning in our schools across Scotland. That must change, and that's why Scottish Conservatives continue to stand up for pupils, parents and teachers and demand SNP ministers deliver the support our children and young people need to thrive. And I move the motion in my name. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Briggs. I now call on Minister Marie Todd to speak to and to move Amendment 17524.3. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, I'd like to thank Mr Briggs for bringing forward his motion calling for a review of additional support for learning and implementation of mainstreaming today. And just to confirm, we'll be voting for the motion and your amendments today. What we're keen to do is seek a collaborative effort from across the chamber to try and solve some of these challenging problems. And I have visited The Yard. Let me assure the members The Yard is well versed of a visit.
I'm very grateful to Marie Todd to take an intervention. And does she agree with the call from Miles Briggs that this must be today a wake-up call for a fundamental change in how we move forward on this point?
Minister.
So, as we'll hear as we go through, if I have an opportunity to get into my speech at all, and the Cabinet Secretary will confirm, the Government is already taking forward a whole suite of work in this area. We're very keen to hear what more we can do, what would add value to the work that's already happening. In opening, I have to begin by highlighting the approach set out in the Additional Support for Learning Act is a highly inclusive one. There continues to be consensus around the principles of inclusion in which our system is based, and the OECD, the Morgan Report and more recently the Education, Children and Young Persons Committee of this Parliament have unanimously supported the inclusive approach set out in the Additional Support for Learning Act 2004. Yes, certainly.
Dean Kerr.
Very brief, because the Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills told the SSTA that she thought the law that has just been described by the Minister was a bit old. What exactly did the Cabinet Secretary mean? Minister.
So, I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary will explain all of that later, but undoubtedly this is a government who are always looking to improve, so there is no question of that. Today's motion refers to a decline in the number of pupil support assistants. And while I understand the concern around this, I'd like to point out that the number of pupil support assistants has increased by 1,800 since 2020, and it's currently the second highest level on record. We continue to invest £15 million a year to help them to respond to children's needs. Now, the Cabinet Secretary can say a great deal more about how we're tackling the increased demand for support for learning in closing today's important debate. But today's motion gives me the opportunity to address recent coverage that I think has risked causing parents unnecessary worry and anxiety. This relates to neurodevelopmental services for those with conditions such as autism and ADHD. Now, in recent weeks, I've heard some members describe children seeking a neurodevelopmental diagnosis as having been removed from CAM's waiting list. Mr Briggs just repeated that rhetoric just now. The implication is, whether intentional or otherwise, that children and families have been left without alternative support. And I want to reassure parents and be very clear with Parliament that that is not the case. Presiding Officer, it's Mental Health Awareness Week. It seems timely to urge all members to take care in the language they use, given it can be unintentionally stigmatising and it could result in people not coming forward to seek support. That is incumbent on all of us. Presiding Officer, CAMS, certainly.
Pam Clancy.
I thank the Minister for taking the intervention, and I agree with her points around language, particularly in this Mental Health Awareness Week. But the reality is, in Glasgow, for example, 9,000 young people have been moved from CAM's waiting lists and put onto alternative pathways, which effectively lead nowhere.
Minister.
Presiding Officer, CAMS is simply not the correct service for children seeking a diagnosis for neurodevelopmental conditions unless they are seeking support for a coexisting mental health condition. I'll take one more on this.
Listening to what the Minister has to say, the biggest problem is, and parents will say this to each and every one of us, it is years to wait for those pathways. If people are lucky enough, and I've spoken to parents who've been selling things to go private for their child, once they've got that diagnosis, it does unlock support. But if it's not going to be recognised, then actually a GP surgery will not provide that care. So we are seeing parents forced to go private, Minister. That is a real concern, and I don't think the Scottish Government are really understanding what that's meaning out in the real world.
Minister.
Our overriding focus is to ensure that people get the right help and support, and that help and support is available to our young people, particularly within the education system. For many, that is best provided through a neurodevelopmental pathway, not CAMS. Now, I make no apology for seeking to ensure that our young people are directed to the most appropriate service for their individual needs. That's right for everyone, for the people who need specialist neurodevelopmental support, and it is right for CAMS services, which can focus on providing the right help for young people who need their specialist mental health support. Now, as part of our continued commitment to ensuring the right supports available to our young people, the Scottish Government, in partnership with COSLA, has been undertaking a review of the implementation of National Neurodevelopmental Specification. That sets expectations for services across Scotland. That review provides an opportunity to reflect on learning and progress and will inform improvements to support health boards and local authorities to deliver the specification. Presiding Officer, we've seen a significant rise in the demand for neurodevelopmental diagnosis in recent years. That's been experienced across the whole of the UK and by all services. Figures on the number of children seeking a diagnosis are not currently reported nationally or published, and I acknowledge that work's needed to improve the quality of data that we have on neurodevelopmental support and services, including a better understanding of the levels of need and the level of support that children and young people
Minister, I appreciate the Minister was
receive.
very generous with interventions, but the Minister will need to conclude as there's no time in hand.
We are working to improve this. I fully recognise the important role a diagnosis can play, but we have to recognise that diagnosis alone doesn't define or determine a child's support needs. That's why our National Neurodevelopmental Specification...
Minister, you will need to conclude. You're well over your time and you will need to move your amendment. Please, could you do so now? Thank you.
So we have clear recommendations that support should
Minister,
be put in place.
I would ask you to move your amendment and please resume your
yes,
seat.
I will move
Could you
my
please?
amendment.
Thank you very much indeed. We have really almost no time in hand now. So I can only deal with the time allocation that I have been given to deal with. I can't magic time out of thin air. I now call on Pam Duncan-Clancy to speak to and move Amendment 17524.1. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I move the amendment in my name. All young people, including those with additional support needs, deserve the opportunity they need to learn and to thrive. And our teachers, support staff, parents and pupils must be thanked immensely for all that they do every day, despite the system that works against them to try to make the reality that children thrive so. We therefore welcome the debate today in Miles Briggs' name, and we will support the motion. We'll support the Government's amendment too, although I have to say the focus in it on warm words and the brevity of it rather indicates that the Government had little to add by way of action in a space that is so desperate for that. That for Scotland, this for Scotland's teachers, support staff, parents and pupils will be disappointing. That's why our amendment adds crucial actions that we believe are necessary to support young people to thrive and to do this alongside their peers, to be included in their schools and to get the support that they need. But, Presiding Officer, the current system is not delivering that. It is, as the committee said, intolerable. The reality is that on this Government's watch, the experience of children and young people with additional support needs, their families and the staff who support them is one of exhaustion, exclusion and crisis. The motion today calls for a review of the implementation of mainstreaming and a new model of support, because action is indeed needed. I also want to be clear. The failure is not on the presumption of mainstream, where children learn together with their peers. The failure is on the part of this Government for failing to build an education system that empowers that. Learning together with your peers matters, and I know this because I lived it. I went to a mainstream school and I did well, but it wasn't by accident. It took strong staff, strong teachers, all who had the time and capacity to support me to get the education that I did. That's what every family in Scotland deserves, and they should not have to fight for their child's education to get it. But right now, they do. Parents feel abandoned by statutory services like CAMHS when they're told there's a new diagnostic pathway, but they're being left with nothing to appear. And I heard what the Minister said, and I know that CAMHS is not what all young people need, but if not CAMHS, what? Without a destination, this isn't a pathway, it is a crisis. And it's a crisis that leaves parents in distress and leaves children without the support that they need. I'll take the Minister.
Minister.
Thank you. So many young children and young people will require more targeted support from specialist services. I acknowledge that. But many children and young people will have their needs met through universal supports at home and in school. And in the additional support for learning legislation is really clear that a diagnosis is not needed to get support. There are also community-based supports, such as a service I'm going to be visiting tomorrow, given its mental health awareness week in North Lanarkshire.
Hopefully Ms Duncan-Clancy's got the gist. Ms Duncan-Clancy.
I thank the Minister for that intervention, and I'm afraid to say for the 9,000 people on waiting lists in Glasgow for the support, they're going to be pretty vocal in explaining that the universal provision is not meeting their needs, and the services that the Minister thinks are there to support young people are just not there, and they're not statutory. This is what the issue is. And most worryingly, this is a crisis that isn't counted or monitored, because these young people are now invisible to the Government, because they're moved from a system that was counted, albeit concerns with the way it was counted, into a system that is not. So these people have become invisible. And it's having a huge impact in our schools, including on our teachers. There are now over 292,000 children with additional support needs in Scotland. I think that figure might be from 2002, so it's probably slightly higher now, forgive me. But just around 1,400 ASN teachers. That's one ASN teacher for every 200 children, against a backdrop of a system that is not providing the support that they need out with school. This is not inclusion. It is a damning indictment of a Government that's walked away, I believe, from education for all. Because what we need now, and my colleagues on our benches, and I hope across the chamber, believe that we need action. That starts with a proper workforce plan. We need a detailed strategy which recruits and retains teachers and ASN specialists, pastoral care staff, alongside urgent reform of support services, including triage and referral, so that nobody is turned away from CAMHS or speech therapy without a plan in place. Presiding Officer, as Angela Morgan said, this is no longer additional. This is the classroom now, and the Government need to wake up and address the real problems that young people are facing.
Thank you, Ms Duncan-Clancy. Thank you. I now call on Ross Greer to open on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I thank Miles Briggs for giving us the opportunity to debate this issue in Parliament today. I should start by making absolutely clear the Scottish Greens' support for the principle of mainstreaming and that we reject any attempt to undo that. But mainstreaming without adequate resourcing just sets up failure. It sets up something worse than failure, actually. We have children in our schools who are being traumatised by being mainstreamed without adequate resources and support to meet their needs. The current situation, one of the comments that we hear most often from parents and carers, from teachers and support staff, is that there needs to be a catastrophic failure for a child before the right support is put in place. Children need to be traumatised before the local authority will allocate the adequate resources to it. And I have sympathy for local authorities and the resource pressures that they are under. But it cannot be right that the system relies on failure before taking action to support a child whose needs are known and understood in advance. And I am glad that the motion today calls for a review. But this review cannot just be repeating what we already know. The review needs to build on the Morgan review. It needs to build on the CSP review, the Audit Scotland paper that Miles Briggs mentioned, multiple committee inquiries. The review needs to focus on the actions, the solutions that are required to address the implementation gap with the presumption of mainstreaming. There is no need for it to just repeat the issues that we are already aware of. And I accept the financial challenges, the resource challenges. That is the single greatest barrier to success in supporting children with additional needs. But that's not an insurmountable barrier, and I would gently encourage colleagues to speak to their party colleagues on the Local Government Committee, which is about to consider my amendments to address some of the issues around local government financing that are relevant to the Housing Bill. But alongside resourcing, we do need to look at policy and legislative solutions. That's why the Green Amendment that wasn't selected today points towards the 2004 Support for Learning Act, because I think that's a clear example of one area where legislation needs to change, because the world has moved on from 2004, our understanding of additional needs has moved on from 2004. But as it stands, coordinated support plans are the only statutory form of plan available for a child with additional needs, the only plan where if there is a failure to support them, they and the adults in their life would have the opportunity of going to a tribunal to seek redress. But to receive a coordinated support plan, a child must be receiving support from at least 2 different sources. And this Parliament has already taken evidence on the challenges with that, because one area that we have made progress on recently is in getting educational psychologists and counsellors back into our schools. But because they are now based in the school, that no longer counts as a separate stream of support for that child. So children who would previously have qualified for a coordinated support plan no longer do because of an improvement we've made in one other area of support. That can't be right. And I don't think that the solution is to update the primary legislation. I think that the solution on the criteria for coordinated support plans is to take it out of primary legislation and put it into regulation, something that government and Parliament would be able to update with far greater ease than we have over the last 2 decades. And I would say to the Government, who I'm sure are going to mention in closing the Additional Support for Learning Action Plan, to really ask themselves if every single action in that plan is implemented and implemented well, will it actually shift the dial? None of us believe that it will. Every action in that plan is laudable and would be useful, but none of it will transform what is a catastrophic situation for so many of the most vulnerable children in our schools, so many children whose needs are not being met, and for the wider school community, especially for their parents and carers. This afternoon is an opportunity for us to talk again about the solutions that are required for this problem. We have spent at least the last decade going over the same ground about what the problems are. What I would really like to hear from the Government in particular this afternoon are the new actions that they are going to take to tackle this crisis in our schools.
Thank you, Mr Greer. I now call on Willie Rennie to open on behalf of the Scottish Liberal Democrats. Up to 4 minutes, please.
This is a letter from a primary school teacher to the First Minister. When I started teaching, inclusion was becoming more and more the norm within schools. Now that there are very few specialist schools, teachers are feeling the effects of inclusion on a daily basis. This policy, whilst admirable in its intention, does not work as it is drastically underfunded. In my school, it's fairly common for teachers to be physically assaulted by children whose needs cannot be met due to the inadequate level of funding. It's even more common for our teachers to be verbally abused. Now, that letter was in 2018. And it was anonymous at the time, because I think that teacher felt as if she raised these issues that she would be criticised for being anti-mainstream and anti-inclusion. I think we've moved on. I think it's a good step that the government's accepting the review of mainstreaming. But we should have recognised this years ago, as it was raised by teachers on a regular basis, because they were feeling it even back then. This was before the pandemic. We can't blame it on the pandemic. This is an issue that's been brewing for a long time, and I'm afraid we have ignored teachers. It was a taboo, but now it's open, and I think we're willing to explore. What I'd like to hear from the Cabinet Secretary when she concludes is, when is this review going to start and when is it going to conclude? And is it going to meet what Ross Greer highlighted, which is practical actions for delivery? Because we have had review after review after review. We do need to actually have actions that make a difference. Now, if you're the other issue before I move on to the practical solutions, this is all interconnected. Absence, ASN, behaviour, violence, all of it is interconnected. And it's no surprise that pupils will want to stay away from school if they're not getting the appropriate support and they're getting violently abused, or there's bad behaviour against them, or they're not able to get taught properly. It's no surprise, and it's all feeding each other. So we need to have a solution that works, and part of that is resource in the classroom. If you are a teacher of 30 pupils, you'll have on average 12 pupils who have got an identified special need. Sometimes it's even much higher than that, and it's not one single need, it's a variety of needs. So you need to be skilled in a whole range of different areas. So that's almost impossible for them to manage. So what are the steps that we need to take? This mainstreaming review needs to look at the fact that the presumption of mainstreaming is also almost turning into a compulsion of mainstreaming. I think some parents actually don't want their child and don't think it's suitable for their child to be in the class. They would prefer for them to get a specialist level of support, but they feel that I've only got 4 minutes. The level of support, the level of cost that would be involved in doing that is prohibitive, and so therefore local authorities are pushing them into the mainstream, which doesn't suit them and it doesn't suit the rest of the class as well. The behavioural action plan needs to start working. We are way behind in terms of even the guidance that's to be implemented before we actually deliver the actual change. So we need to make much more swifter steps on the behaviour. And then the final bit is resources. And this is tough. We know that. We've supported the budget this year in order to try and get more support into the classroom. But we need to, when the decisions are made about budgets, we need to consider this in the round to make sure that we're providing the appropriate level of support to make a difference.
Thank you, Mr Rennie. We now move to the open debate. Backbench speeches of up to 4 minutes. And I call Douglas Ross to be followed by Fulton McGregor. Mr Ross.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I think this is a very important debate brought forward by Miles Briggs and the Scottish Conservatives, and I've been struck by the amendment that we have from the Scottish Government. And I think the Minister said that their amendment is worded in such a way, simply adding on to the Conservative motion, because they want consensus and they want to move forward. Maybe it's a cynic in me, and maybe I can be proven wrong by the Cabinet Secretary or the Minister. Can they confirm that it was the fact that they agree with every single word in this motion, and as soon as it dropped into their mailbox, they said, yes, we are going to support that? Or did they make some discreet attempts with the other parties to find a body of votes in this chamber to strike out a lot of the critical text in here and replace it with something bland and vague, as the SNP so always do? And I don't know if any minister would want to deny that or say that's the truth. No? So maybe that's the case that we've got here, that the government have now accepted, having lost their majority when the Greens left office, that it is more difficult to stitch up some deals to get critical elements of motions removed. And I think that's healthy. I think it's now forcing the government to do things that clearly they wouldn't normally want to do, because there is no doubt this is a major issue. Stephen Boyle's Audit Scotland report was deeply damning on additional support for learning, but it was also sadly predictable. And I'm just going to speak about a couple of cases that I've had in Murray recently. Miles Briggs has spoken about examples, Pam Duncan-Glancy in Glasgow, and the other speakers so far. So it cannot only be opposition MSPs who have people coming to their surgeries, reaching out to them, writing to the First Minister and copying in letters, as Willie Rennie was citing there. SNP ministers and backbenchers must be getting the exact same. But in Lossiemouth, just a few weeks ago when I had a surgery, a parent came to me to say she was at the end of her tether because she has seen very clearly the support in the school, the primary school for her son, has dwindled in recent years. And she is facing the consequences of that at home and when he's out of school, because he's not getting the same level of support and assistance as he did just a few years ago. And just a couple of weeks ago, I had a surgery in Nakando, and quite a harrowing case of a mum that came to me about her son, who for 4 years tried to get a diagnosis for ADHD through the NHS. And for 4 years, they came up against brick walls and could not get the diagnosis they needed. So they spent some personal money that had been gifted to them from the boy's grandmother, because she could see how urgent this was, to go privately to Stirling. And they very quickly got a diagnosis and indeed medication, which is making a big difference to this young boy's life. But because that diagnosis was made by a private operator, the NHS board will not pay for the medication he now needs. Now, I've written to both the Health Board and the Scottish Government about this, and in fact, I hadn't had a response, and my office chased it up in advance of today's debate. While Willie Rennie was on his feet, so less than 4 minutes ago, the NHS board have now come back to me to say they will meet with the family and they will discuss this. But it shouldn't take MSPs threatening to raise this in Parliament, raising it with ministers, writing to the Health Board to get the response this family and this young man needs to ensure that he gets the support that is so clearly needed. So what I want to see from today's debate is consensus across the parties that we all accept there is a problem. The SNP now do that by accepting the motion and the criticism within the motion. But as others have said, we also need action. We cannot come back here in a few months or a few years' time and say the same things and not deliver. It is over to the government now to take the feeling from the chamber today and from across the political parties to finally get something done to deliver for young people and families across Scotland. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Ross. I now call Fulton McGregor to be followed by Liz Smith. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome this debate on what is a very important issue for my constituents as well as those across the country. And there is no doubt that the number of ASN cases are rising, and this is very much reflected in my own caseload. People are coming to my surgeries now on a regular basis to seek advice and assistance, and particularly when placing requests for specialist provision are being denied. There has been a steady and rapid increase, and the number of such cases my office and I are dealing with this year far exceeds that of the years pre-pandemic. Parents and children are being left frustrated and worried, and many are turning to the first-tier tribunal once all avenues with the Council have been explored. I also visit schools in my constituency every Monday, and I can testify to the fantastic work our dedicated teaching staff and talented pupils are involved in. However, in almost all schools, I hear that the number of young people needing additional supports is rising, and this is putting extra pressure on the schools, of course. There is no doubt local authorities, North Lanarkshire Council in this instance, are under pressure in this regard, and of course it doesn't help that they have often taken decisions to cut key resources, such as classroom assistants, for example, in my local authority area. But I know the Council are also trying to find other solutions. For example, on Monday this week, I was out at Shawhead Primary School in Coatbridge, where I was informed that from next term the school would be used as a new enhanced mainstream provision with capacity for 10 children who have been denied ASN placements. This will involve additional staff and resources at the school, and I very much welcome this step, and I'm keen to find out how this exciting policy develops. And also, Presiding Officer, there is no doubt the Scottish Government have supported local authorities to deliver in this area with the 2023-24 spending on additional support for learning at over £1 billion. But I do believe that we need to think more radical. There is a solution right in front of us that can help to tackle the rising incidence of additional needs, as well as behavioural difficulties, and also close the attainment gap. The Cabinet Secretary will know what I'm going to say. It will be no surprise, because that's because I believe the introduction of a play-based kindergarten stage could be that very solution. For several years now, I've advocated the introduction of a kindergarten stage for Scotland. Almost a year ago, I brought a members' debate to the Chamber on fostering a discussion on a kindergarten stage. The debate was engaging, with positive feedback on the idea from members across the chamber. And as I said in that debate, the UK is a complete outlier when we look at when our children start school, with our primary pupils starting between 2 and 3 years earlier than many of their European counterparts. Kindergarten has the opportunity to allow children to flourish physically, mentally and socially. And I understand the introduction of a kindergarten stage will not necessarily solve all the factors behind why pupils may need additional support needs. However, I firmly believe that taking this step will benefit pupils immensely and may address some developmental issues that can occur with our children. We are currently in a system whereby children are being expected to make a jarring transition from a nursery environment to a school environment while they are still between critical developmental milestones. I could say so much more on this issue about how the evidence points to reductions in the attainment gap and behavioural difficulties, but time is tight in this debate, so I will simply end by urging the Cabinet Secretary to please explore this issue further, especially ahead of manifestos being developed for 2026. It won't solve all our issues in our education system overnight, and of course work must be done to help those children struggling right now. But the introduction of a well-designed kindergarten phase to at least age 6, possibly 7, will reap its huge benefits in 5 to 10 years' time. It could be truly game-changing, and it's time for the Government and the Parliament as a whole to be bold, come together and deliver this system that lets children be children, continues to support parents and carers, and finally puts an end to the current Victorian-based model of children starting formal school at 4 or 5. If we are committed to such a positive change in just 5 to 10 years' time, debates like this could be a thing of the past. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr McGregor. I now call Liz Smith to be followed by Richard Leonard. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. When I entered this Parliament in 2007, the Scottish Government introduced the policy of GIRFIC. Now, at the time, that was seen as yet another acronym in the great usual clutter of educational jargon. But that policy actually mattered because, or it should have been anyway, it should have mattered, it should have been the scaffold of support for every single child across Scotland. Now, I would contest that any decent teacher or any educational professional should have GIRFIC within their DNA. It shouldn't take a government to tell us why it matters, but as time has progressed, there are many teachers and parents telling us that the implementation of GIRFIC is being undermined by several key aspects of education just now, most especially about ASN. As others have said, the recent evidence about the extent of the increase in the number of ASN pupils is very clear. And so too is the evidence about the accompanying concerns amongst teachers and parents and amongst pupils themselves. That said, we should not forget that part of the reason for the increase is better diagnosis. That's a good thing. But we should be very clear about the increasing complexities which are facing schools as they seek to provide the very best education for every child, no matter who he or she may be. And of course, part of this is about the interpretation of the principle of equity and the principle of mainstreaming. All well and good in theory, but much more difficult in practice. And can I be clear about the difference between equality in education and equity? If we talk about equality, we would be offering exactly the same education to all pupils. But the term equity is different, because it's about fairness and justice, but also recognising that we do not all start from the same place. That principle of equity is so important when it comes to education, and it articulates perfectly with the principle of GIRFIC. GIRFIC is all about ensuring that all pupils have the opportunity to fulfil their full potential, and it is something that should underpin all debates about ASN provision. And incidentally, it's also about the principle that is underpinning my member's bill on residential outdoor education. And from this principle of equity, we can examine the principle of mainstreaming. I think that we can probably all agree in theory that mainstreaming is in line with several of the great traditions of Scottish education. But in practice, especially now, it is much harder to justify that it is in line with GIRFIC. And that's because we know only too well that there is an increasing number of pupils for whom being in a mainstream classroom is not in their best educational interests. Parents tell us this, teachers tell us this, and union representatives tell us this. And I worry greatly that some children end up being placed in mainstream classes by local authorities for financial rather than for educational reasons. So there is a very important debate to be had about what we can and we cannot achieve by mainstreaming. Added to that is the question of specialist care and whether that can always be provided in every single local authority, or indeed without the help of the independent sector, which in many schools has a long tradition of being able to support additional support for learning. And I say gently to the Labour Party that that's just another reason why the assault of VAT on the independent sector is so misguided, because it's some of the families with important additional support needs who have been forced to leave that sector. And of course, what many teachers and parents, and indeed pupils, rightly raise is that the overstretch in mainstreaming often means that pupils with additional support needs get labelled as badly behaved. Now, as Willie Rennie said, sometimes that is true, but more often that is not true. They are not the same thing, and that is something that we should be considering for the best interests of every child. Now, last week I was very grateful to the Education for supporting one of my amendments designed to ensure that the inspection process in all our schools is broadened further. That has to happen in additional support for learning as well. Cabinet Secretary, it is time that we did something properly about GIRFEC and supporting every child in the context of additional support for learning.
Thank you, Ms Smith. I now call Richard Leonard to be followed by Karen Adam. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And let me say at the very start, an evaluation of inclusion of mainstreaming 2 decades after the enactment of the Educational Additional Support for Learning Scotland Act 2004 is one thing, but going back to the old systems of segregation, of removal, of exclusion is something we should not support. The presumption of mainstreaming is, in my view, correct. Equality, diversity and the comprehensive principle are correct. But of course there are some big questions, because over the last 2 decades there has been an 8-fold increase in the number of children and young people who need additional support for learning, some of it long-term, some of it short-term, and it is not evenly spread. Children in our most deprived areas are twice as likely to need additional support for learning as children living in the least deprived areas. But as the Auditor-General warned Parliament when he gave evidence in March, this is not reflected in how councils are funded for their education service. But neither is it reflected in education planning, it is not reflected in teacher training, it is not reflected in class sizes. And we learned as well that good quality data does not exist. There are gaps and inconsistencies. In fact, to such an extent that Audit Scotland and the Accounts Commission could not undertake a full performance audit of additional support for learning in Scotland, which they intended to do originally, because the data was either non-existent, inconsistent or unreliable. Yoshiko Gibo, a senior auditor, also told us the data that is currently available was designed as a way of monitoring whether the ASL legislation had been put in place as intended, not as a way of understanding children's support needs. So when the Scottish Government's Director-General for Education gave evidence to the Public Audit Committee just 7 days ago, he told us of the international experience. He told us that Scotland spends more per pupil than any other part of the UK, that we have lower pupil-teacher ratios than any other part of the UK. But these are inputs, not outcomes. We were even told that there was not a perfect correlation between deprivation and additional support needs, because, I quote, Orkney has high levels of ASN and low deprivation, which is to misrepresent, to distort the overwhelming evidence that a link between poverty, inequality and learning is both irrefutable and it is causal. And it is to negate everything the Scottish Government has told the people and this Parliament for years about closing the educational attainment gap. We have legal obligations under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, but we also have enduring moral obligations too. We need to get this right, because children are only 5 once, only 8 once, only 11 once, only 15 once. So there's no good saying we'll carry out reviews and we'll sort this out over the next 5 years. We need a greater sense of urgency and an end to Scottish Government complacency. Otherwise, for these children and young people, it may be too late. Because we need to get it right for every child, but we also need to get it right for every child at the first time of asking.
Thank you, Mr Leonard. And I now call Karen Adam. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I really do welcome this debate, and I thank colleagues across the Chamber for bringing attention to such an important issue. The additional support for learning and implementation of mainstreaming is a vital one, and it is one that I do believe we should keep front and centre. And I have had conversations with Government, with the Cabinet Secretary and the Minister, and I do not believe it is a conversation that they do shy away from. I'm going to speak specifically about neurodivergence, and since my time as a councillor and now an MSP, this has been the #1 issue raised with me by constituents. Week in and week out, families have contacted me exhausted and frustrated and often feeling powerless. And this isn't just because of the day-to-day challenges of parenting neurodivergent children, but they're constantly having to fight to be understood. And that's what I really want to focus on, is that understanding. They need to be listened to, and they need to access support systems that are there. The systems are there. But they are quite often gate-kept by people who don't understand. I have been quite open about my own lived experience, and I've had children. And now I could stand here and say that I had a child who actually waited about 8 years for a diagnosis of ADHD. But that wasn't on a waiting list, and this is what we need to be specific about. This was 8 years because I was asking for teachers to see what I saw in my child, but they didn't. So that diagnostic pathway was blocked and gate-kept several times. When I begged, and they finally got through to get in this diagnostic pathway, it took a matter of months, actually, and he was helped and supported. And I was told that it's probably one of the strongest presenting ADHD cases they'd seen. So what was the issue there? It wasn't that the waiting list was 8 years long. It was that the people on the ground who had access to that pathway or could give access to my child didn't understand the whole what neurodivergence could present like. I understand it's not financially viable to offer one-to-one support to every single neurodivergent child. And I do agree that trauma-informed practice is really important. But there is that understanding that's needed. Neurodivergent children can come across, they've got a strong sense of justice, they've got a strong sense of fairness, and oftentimes people can add negative connotations to that and say that they come across as a bit maybe obstinate. And that can be time-consuming in some busy classrooms, but that's where that understanding matters. And these qualities can actually be nurtured, and this is something that makes great transferable skills into the real world, she says, standing here with a strong sense of social justice. I warmly welcome the significant investment from the Scottish Government that they have made towards ASL provision. I know that they have been listening and are working hard to find solutions. But I would say that money and policy alone are not enough. Those who are delivering the services on the ground must have an understanding of how neurodivergence presents and what is needed for these children. I've had a child placed on a reduced timetable. I get it. I've been there when the anxiety kicks in, when the phone rings, been unable to work in traditional ways for many years because I've had to go to the school and ask my child to climb down from the shed after he'd emptied all the gym equipment out. I get it. But too often the relationship between parents and schools can become adversarial. And what we need to do is replace that tension with trust and honest and open communication and stop the blame game on everyone and just come up with the constructive solutions to move forward to see what is best for everyone in and out the classroom. Presiding Officer, I have to skip quite a bit here, but I want to give a shout out to Banff Academy, who have an excellent example of something that was really a small action that's made a big impact. I went to their school and wondered why it was
Ms Adam, you are over your time, and just to counsel you to bring your remarks to close, please.
But they don't have a school bell. And that has made a massive impact. There's no jarring noise, there's no sudden movement, and it helps people take responsibility for their timekeeping, she said ironically.
Ms Adam, your time is over.
Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. Right, we will now move to closing speeches. I call on Ross Greer to close on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In opening, the Minister mentioned staffing and specifically issues around numbers of support staff in our schools. And I do think that that's worth exploring a bit more, because it also connects to Richard Leonard's point around the difficulties that Audit Scotland faced when they were trying to accurately ascertain the state of play in relation to ASN support in our schools. Because one of the issues in relation to support staff is it got to the point around 2019 where government statisticians were no longer able to distinguish between ASN support staff and classroom or general pupil support assistants. So from that point onward, in the school staff census, they began to group these two categories together. And when Parliament's Education Committee brought them in to explain that decision, they simply explained it was because that at a local level, the lines had been blurred so much that there was no meaningful distinction. And what that was really doing was masking the almost complete disappearance of dedicated ASN support staff in our schools. That's why I pushed, and when my party was in government, we worked together with the Cabinet Secretary to develop policy proposals for a system of accreditation and registration for ASN support staff, because it is very often and I mean this by no means as a sign of disrespect, but it's often the least qualified and least well paid members of staff in a school who are expected to provide the most complex and often the most intimate personal support to pupils. And that is wrong for the pupil, and it is wrong for the member of staff who is expected to do that for far too little pay and without adequate training and support to do so. But it's not just support staff. We've seen a significant reduction in ASN teachers relative to the number of pupils, and even in absolute terms, no increase in ASN teachers in our schools. And the government made an effort a few years ago to promote ASN teaching through the lead teacher pathway, or the lead teacher model. I think we're at the point where we can all acknowledge that that has not worked. There was no clear incentive for a teacher to take that course. We need to give teachers the opportunity to move into ASN specialist teaching as a point of career progression. So really the only way that I think we can encourage more teachers into ASN teaching is if we make it a promoted post. We hear constantly from teachers that they want the opportunities of career progression without moving into management positions. They still want to work with children and young people. Making ASN teaching a promoted post would be one of the obvious ways to do that. Yes, it would require additional resources. Promoted posts have higher salaries attached to them. But we need to recognise the need to have those specialist staff in our schools, both teachers and support staff. One of the first constituents I spoke to after I was first elected in 2016 was a young woman, a 15-year-old young woman who was in high school and is deaf. And she told me how on her first day of high school, she had been assigned a member of staff for one-on-one support. She thought this is fantastic. Her anxiety was going down. This dedicated support would be there. Until that member of staff said to her that they had only ever worked before with children who had autism, but they were sure that between the two of them, they would be able to work out how to provide the right support for them. That was a failure, not just for that young woman, and there have been plenty of examples that constituents have brought to me since. It was a failure for that member of staff as well. They had not been adequately supported to do their job, to do the job that they had been assigned to. Just briefly before closing, Presiding Officer, I want to address some of the issues around identification, because I think Richard Leonard made another really important point around, quite rightly, we have a very broad definition of additional support needs. So there's a whole range of advantages to that. But when it's at the point where it's 40% of all children, and where everything from being gifted to being a permanent wheelchair user is an additional support need, one category grouped together is masking a whole range of issues, and it makes it hard to identify the right kind of support. So whilst I do think we should keep that definition, I think we need better disaggregation of that data going forward. There are serious resource implications to getting this right, but there are also policy and legislative changes that we could be making right now with no cost that would at least make some initial progress while we resolve those more difficult issues of resources. And our children deserve this. It is a crisis in our schools. These changes need to be delivered now. I hope the Cabinet Secretary can commit to take at least some actions this
afternoon. Thank you, Mr Ross. Thank you. I now call on Martin Whitfield to close on behalf of Scottish Labour. Up to 4 minutes, please.
I'm very grateful, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I think the tensions in some of the submissions with regard to time show the importance of this matter, and indeed show what other areas we should, as a chamber, have the opportunity to explore. I'd just like to start sort of at the end first with regard to Ross Greer's comments about the elite teacher programme and the previous chartered teacher programme. The reality is that we seem unable to celebrate experienced, qualified and wise teachers staying in the classroom. We want to yank them out and place them in management with HR, finance and other obligations which none of their training suits, but actually steals from our young people some of the most gifted opportunities they would have to be with a teacher, a pedagogue who can be with them and meet them where they are. And that speaks, I think, very much to the ASN situation that we find ourselves in, because I think, picking up on Karen Adams' contribution that was slightly curtailed and the shout-out that I think she was about to make, these young people bring very, very special gifts. They have enormous strengths that other children do not have. And the ability for that group to coalesce and be empathetic both to each other's needs, but also to celebrate each other's strengths, is an incredibly powerful opportunity that every person, not just children, should have the opportunity to do. But within our education system and in defence of mainstreaming, that opportunity can only exist if we can facilitate mainstreaming for as many of our children that will work for. And that requires, if we've heard, resource. And I want to go back to the opening contribution from Marie Todd, and to be grateful to her for the number of interventions that she took. And I think it's interesting that the government acknowledge that at the minute the support staff are at the second highest on record. And I think it speaks to Ross Greer's comment about how you then measure that. Even at the second highest, that's still insufficient for the very significant numbers of ASN-identified children that we have. But I also want to talk about the challenge that's occurred in a number of debates with regard to diagnosis, particularly with regard to autistic children and the alternative pathways that are constantly raised. And I would like to thank the National Autistic Society of Scotland for their briefing in relation today. We very quickly conflate the need for a diagnosis from a medical point of view and the requirement that there be no diagnosis but displaying elements that require additional support to trigger the support that occurs within our education system. And we drift between those in this chamber, and I don't think we do it deliberately, but the failure to differentiate between the two leads then to the problem that we've noted with regard to the coordinated care plans, where there are requirements for external inputs. We also fail, I think, to understand the importance that a diagnosis has for parents, but also for the children themselves, to allow them to understand their identity, to understand their strengths, to understand the challenges that they may face. And there's been a call to be careful with regard to the language that's used, and I think we need to do that, because not only within the chamber is that challenge convoluted, it rolls out. There are parents who feel that their young person has been removed from a list that would have resulted in a diagnosis, and they don't know how to do it. So, in summing up, if the Cabinet Secretary could address one of the requests of the National Autistic Society, is that the Scottish Government clarify if and how, if it is going to implement a nationwide system for accessing autism and ADHD diagnosis, what that will specifically look like. Because I think, again, to echo the gatekeepers of some of the pathways that are there, people do not know how to do it. I recognise time is short. It's been a fascinating debate, and I think it's one that we should return to in government time so that we can discuss some of the solutions that we've been shown today. I'm grateful, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Whitfield. I now call on Cabinet Secretary Jenna Garuth to close on behalf of the Scottish Government. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I've been really impressed by the thoughtful and powerful contributions we've heard from across the chamber this afternoon, and I thank Miles Briggs for raising this topic. It is a topic that he will know is constantly raised with me in my own mailbag, but also in my visits to schools. I was in a school this morning, meeting with staff, speaking to young people about their experiences in schools. And I want to put on record my thanks to Molly this morning, who I was playing shops with, and to Ellis, who asked me for more playtime. And there was also an ask for more sharing from some of the primary school kids this morning. So it was a heartening visit, and it was all about the Pupil Equity Fund and the difference it has made in our schools. Now, that funding is providing extra money to Scotland's head teachers today to help them pay for investments, such as we've heard from members across the chamber today, for extra staff. We know it's employing around 3,000 extra staff in our schools today. Now, I was struck by the motion today in calling for another review, and of course in previous debates brought by the Conservatives, I see one of Mr Briggs' colleagues nodding. I'm sure I was instructed by her previously that the time for reviews is now over. However, I accept the gravity of the challenge here, and I think it is important that we as a Parliament come together to recognise what more needs to be done on behalf of Scotland's children and young people. I do think it's important, to the points Willie Rennie made, that there is a collective understanding of what the scope of that review should be. There have been some different ideas in relation to that in terms of the role of local government, for example, who I note are not expressly mentioned in the motion, but Mr Briggs did mention. I would want COSLA to be at the table for any engagement on, for example, the points that Ms Duncan Glancy has raised in relation to workforce planning. I also heard the points that Ms Adam made in relation to Banff Academy. I have experienced the Nobel School that she mentioned, and of course if I had stayed in the North East I would have gone to Banff Academy. But Banff Academy's approach to not having a school bell has had a transformative impact on the young people and the staff in that school, particularly those with an identified additional support need. I want to come to mention comments from colleagues, but I'm conscious that time is tight today, Presiding Officer. Liz Smith made, I thought, a really helpful contribution. She talked about the importance of GIRFEC, the interaction between that and our approach to ASN in our schools. And we know that in the past, the point I think that Mr Kerr was making earlier in relation to my commentary on Friday at the SSTA Congress was that when we introduced the Act in 2004, we had far fewer children with an identified additional support need. Today we know in most schools it's about 40%. In some schools I visit it's over 50%. So the landscape has fundamentally changed in terms of when that legislation was introduced and how it's being enacted today. That, I think, plays to the points made in the Labour Party's amendment, which are about how that Act interacts with delivery at local level. And I don't think we heard disagreement on that today. More broadly, there was commentary in relation to data, and I'm sure colleagues will have seen the commitment in the programme for government around the Data Summit. Now, one of the issues around about consistency of data that we've highlighted is that we have a broad approach to gathering data in terms of additional support needs. That includes things such as children who have suffered childhood bereavement. It's a broad approach that looks at high-achieving children as well. It covers lots of different additional support needs. Happy to do so.
Miles Briggs.
Secretary for taking this intervention. Can I ask, does that also include recording how many parents have now received a private diagnosis for their child? And I also received an email from one of the GP practices who have said to me, unfortunately, shared care prescribing agreements have been established only between NHS primary and NHS secondary care. So on the back of this debate, will government go away and look at how these can be established for people who have that private diagnosis for their child and want that shared care?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm happy to commit to look at that work, and in relation to the private diagnosis point, that might be an issue that local authorities gather data on. It wouldn't be something we in Scottish Government do, given the statutory responsibility falls with local government, but I'm more than happy to engage with the member on those points. But Mr Briggs made some really substantial points around teachers facing some really challenging pressures. Now, Mr Rennie is right to say that the pandemic is not the causation factor here. I do think it has compounded some of the challenge in our schools. We speak regularly in education debates about those wider challenges, and Mr Rennie was also right not to divorce those wider challenges, whether that be in relation to attendance, behaviour, attainment, from issues in relation to additional support needs. And I wonder, in the totality of the review, if the opposition might want to reflect on that in terms of the scope, that we are not narrowing our focus here too much on additional support needs, and that we are mindful of those wider challenges across our school estate post-pandemic. Presiding Officer, I am very mindful of time, and I will move on shortly. In closing, I do want to make a number of points around about the progress that we have seen with our children with identified support needs in recent years. We see the attainment gap closing, which is certainly welcome news. And we also see that success is measured in different ways for children with an identified support need. We also know that there is a strength of support in the position in relation to mainstreaming. That was a point I thought powerfully conveyed by Richard Leonard. From all of our trade unions, and of course from the OECD, and more recently from the National Discussion on Education, which reported in 2023 that it is a strength of Scotland's education system. But I accept the challenges that we have heard from opposition members today, and to that end I would propose that we engage at the earliest possible opportunity in a roundtable along with COSLA, along with local government, to talk to what more might be able to be done in relation to supporting additional support needs in our schools. I mentioned some of the investment we've made through PEP, but it's also worthwhile
you will need to conclude.
Putting on record the funding we've provided, over £1 billion in the last financial year alone, for additional support needs. I think today's been a really helpful debate, and I'm more than happy to engage with opposition members on the next steps in supporting our holistic approach to Scottish education.
I now call on Ros McCall to wind up the debate on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to close the debate on behalf of the Scottish Conservative business today, especially as this is such an important issue. And on the Cabinet Secretary's last point regarding another review, as an opposition party, our options are slightly limited on how we get action in this. So a review it happens to be. But I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's offer of a roundtable and to act on this issue. So we will look forward to that. So much so that we're looking at this debate here in Scottish Conservative time, and we're debating again in our party business, which proves that our priorities are the same as any parent, grandparent or carer who wants to see a system that works for their child, not against them, wants to see a constructive education model that will empower their child to achieve, not doom them to fail, and support process that understands that the need of their particular child is not a tick-box exercise that works for the limited few. The statistics highlighting the scale of this issue that assisted support learning brings to our schools, and the figures as of 2024 show that there were 284,448 pupils that had an additional support need. As already been mentioned, that's 40% of all pupils, and that number of pupils has increased markedly since 2010, and there continues to be a year-on-year increase. And yes, we can applaud the continued improvements in recording and identifying ASN and the reduction in the introduction of additional need types, but if we don't put the correct processes in place, then all the recording and identifying is for naught. Out of those almost 285,000 pupils, 93 of them spent all of their time in mainstream classes. Presiding Officer, if we're going to have the presumption of mainstreaming in Scotland, then it is incumbent on the Scottish Government to ensure that staffing levels, processes, funding and support is indeed adequate for both the pupils and teachers alike, and unfortunately that's not the case. I'd like to take a couple of moments just to talk about some of the contributions. So to Richard Leonard and to Ross Gear, support for the presumption of mainstreaming, a review on that doesn't suggest a return to old and previous ways. But we need to actually have a system that is working, and a review is certainly a way to do that. Pam Duncan-Glancy highlighted that it can work, and is testament to that in herself, but highlighted also that it comes from strong staff and strong teachers, and that is so important in this debate. Willie Rennie also highlighted that there's a shift maybe from the presumption of mainstreaming to more of a compulsion to mainstreaming. I think that's a very interesting phrase, which doesn't work for every child, and that was also highlighted by my colleague Liz Smith, because getting it right for every child was what this was based on, and that's not what we're doing. I'd like to say to Karen Mann, Ms Adams, that was an exceptionally strong contribution, but it comes back to the same point that resources and training within our education processes is so important to make sure that we get the pathways right. Miles Briggs, in the motion, has also highlighted the importance of having our councils, local authorities and COSLA included in this discussion, and we do need a call to action, and we do need clear timescales. And finally, Fulton McGregor, kindergarten, you're not going to get an argument with me on that one. The ability for our children to be ready to learn is so vital, and the focus of early years on that is fundamental. Deputy Presiding Officer, it's more than important than ever that we review the situation regarding ASN in our schools. We have children presenting as in the need for additional support if they have learning difficulties such as dyslexia, dyscalculia or dyspraxia. Equally, additional support is required if a young person has mental health issues such as anxiety or depression. We can see children needing learning support because they're autistic or have motor or sensory impairments. This is a massive range, and this has been mentioned already by Ross Greer. And the range of support needed in our mainstream classrooms is vast. And the Audit Scotland report states the Scottish Government hasn't planned effectively for the potential impact of this approach to ASL. It is not specifically reflected in funding formulas for education and for education planning, such as training for teachers and support staff, class sizes and the designs of our school buildings. It goes on to state, from existing data, it is not possible to conclude whether levels of funding, staffing levels and mix are appropriate to meet the current needs. So resourcing decisions to deliver agreed outcomes need to be based on a clear understanding of pupils' additional support needs. Surely, if the range of needs is broad and diverse, the training, funding and understanding must be broad too. So in conclusion, I support the request that the current system of ASM provision is reviewed to ensure we're providing adequate support for our young people and halting that inadequate inequality which is failing too many Scots. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms McCall. That concludes the debate on review of additional support for learning and implementation of mainstreaming. And there'll be a short pause before we move on to the next item of business to allow frontbench teams to change position, should they so wish. Thank you.